Hi, everyone. We're just getting started here. I think, folks, the format that we're using for Microsoft Teams and like a webinar format, I believe it's automatic camera off and mute participants, but we're going to investigate because we do want to kind of hold a bit of a discussion at the end here that we could kind of hopefully see some of you and obviously hear you too. So just give us a couple minutes here. We're going to wait for a few more attendees and then get started. Okay, Mari, I figured out how to allow cameras and mics for attendees. That's why you've noticed a couple more pop up. So maybe I'll just turn them back off until we get to our discussion period.
Sounds good.
Shall we get started then?
Yeah,
sure. 6:03. So thanks for joining us this evening. My name's Mary Jane Roger. I'm the executive director here at the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust. And I'm joined today by two of our fellow staffers on the camera here, Mari Lamarck and Shayla Nickerson. I'll just get them to introduce themselves as well.
Oh, I'm Mari. I'm the land trust manager. You folks probably have been receiving emails from me.
And I'm Shayla Nickerson. I'm the stewardship coordinator.
Great, thanks, guys. We're also joined today by at least one of our board members, two of our board members, I think. So we do have Andrew Oliver, who is our secretary, as well as Greg Watson, who's a member at large, joining us today too. So we're kind of here to answer your questions, and Mari's going to give probably about a 40-minute presentation on the trust itself. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today in Mi'kma'ki. In particular, I'm beaming in from Gaspawick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the peace and friendship treaties with the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey people, which were first signed in 1726. Where we understand that these treaties did not deal with the surrender of land and resources, but in fact recognized the Mi'kmaq and the title that established rules, what would be an ongoing relationship between nations. And we did wanted to make particular note today that the term private lands and conservation itself are complicated topics when we're dealing or trying to encourage reconciliation. Canada as a nation was built on lands that were already occupied by Indigenous people and under their own laws and their own societies at the time, which discovery and colonization by Europeans. We acknowledge the Mi'kmaq as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land and thank them for sharing their homeland with us. And we are all treaty people. So I'll now pass it off to Mari. On like a little bit of the housekeeping front, like we are planning to facilitate a Q&A after the talk. we've been fortunate that our previous in-person info session, we were able to generate a bit of a discussion throughout Mari's presentation. But just because of the logistics associated with Teams and webinar, we'll just wait for Q&A until the end. But I would encourage folks to chat, to either probably just use the chat. There is a chat and a Q&A function, but probably just use the chat so everyone can see if you do have a question that arises throughout the presentation. If it's like a quick question, I'll probably just respond to it in the chat. And if it's a bigger, broader question, then we will bring it up to address in front of everyone during the discussion period. So with that, I will pass it off to Mari.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can we just get an okay here? That is good to go.
Good to go.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So this is just a short agenda that MJ dove right into. But this is my title page. So thank you everybody for joining us. As MJ said, my name is Mari. I'm the Land Trust Manager here at the Working Woodlands Trust. I wanted to share a little bit about our organization, where we came from, what we're doing, and kind of where we're going. Definitely welcome questions, and as MJ said, throw them in the chat and we can chat about them afterwards. So where was the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust? What's its origin story? And it comes from a partnership with the Medway Community Forest Cooperative. So the MCFC, if you don't know, is a member-based, community-led for-profit social enterprise that manages a 15,000 hectare Crown land license area in Annapolis County. The MCFC pilots alternatives to traditional Crown land management and balances multiple values while practicing ecologically based forest management. The development of the land trust came out of a need for the MCFC to connect with privately owned land and woodland stewards. Many of these stewards, as we'll discuss, are an aging population and are looking for a way to secure their stewardship legacy. And this is really where the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust kind of came from, to serve that private woodland steward in some way. So a little bit about our team. As you've met MJ and Shayla and myself, we're the core staff right now. We are having an outreach and communications coordinator joining us at the beginning of April, but we're also governed by a fantastic board of directors. I'm not going to name them all here, but you might recognize some names. These folks have been integral in guiding the creation of the Working Woodlands Trust. Excuse me. And you can see that they represent both individual land stewards as well as stewardship organizations across the province. So for both the MCFC and the Working Woodlands Trust, integrating Mi'kmaq values is integral to our work. We recognize that colonial systems have historically created barriers for Indigenous peoples to access private lands. And this is really important while we're trying to conserve private lands. So also the conservation movement has largely benefited from the appropriation of Indigenous lands. So we are doing our best to integrate two-eyed seeing into our management practices and policy development. We participate in ongoing learning and educational opportunities from our Indigenous partners. And we're actively building relationships to alleviate barriers and to continue to have the hard conversations. regarding private land ownership, Indigenous access, and reconciliation. So why build a working woodlands trust? Ultimately, the core sentiment of the Working Woodlands Trust is to uphold forest stewardship and stewardship legacies that already exist on private woodlands. So as woodland stewards age, we know that there's going to be a large intergenerational transfer of land assets to their kin. A lot of land stewards are in retirement and might not have a clear succession plan for who will manage their woodlands after their time. So in these events, when land changes hands, a number of scenarios can occur. For one, new owners who inherit land might be displaced or disconnected to the forest, and they might sell off the land to the highest bidder, which puts that at risk for liquidation logging, subdivision, some large-scale landscape or land use changes. Current owners might also be forced to cut a large portion of their woodlands to pay for capital gains tax, or large purchases or retirement, and kind of seeing the woodlot as more of a bank account. And it helps kind of cover some of these major life costs that happen at the end of life. So through placing working forest easements, which we'll get into a little bit later, we hope to protect that forest health and uphold stewardship legacies, supporting woodland stewards through revenue generation as well as conservation. So in addition to the risks associated with lands changing hands, common threats to forest health and forest integrity across the province include liquidation, logging, and clear cutting. Leahy reports that approximately 90% of harvesting that's happening on private land is liquidation or clear cutting. A huge amount. We also have the conversion of forest land into agriculture. Predominantly, or a big influence in that is the blueberry production and the blueberry industry in the province. And then we also have subdivision and development. Particularly obvious and a good example is the small lakeside properties, as you can see in this little image, like the Molega Lake area. So ultimately, we see the Working Woodlands Trust as a solution to some of these large land use changes. We vision that the Working Woodlands Trust will maintain forest cover forever by not only sustaining the biodiversity and canopy cover and ecosystem health, but also sustaining income generation possibility over time, instead of that liquidation logging cycle. We also support landscape connectivity. So this is the movement of biodiversity in between landscapes, and which is, this habitat fragmentation is so detrimental to our biodiversity in the province, and having these connected forested landscapes really support that. And then finally, we see the potential of ecological forestry to be a way of life, and growing a community asset through ecological forestry rather than this clear cutting cycle. So we see the woodland stewards as a center component to the success of this organization. So with the Working Woodlands Trust, we will uphold stewardship legacies of forest stewards and woodlot owners through sustainable harvesting. So our easements are attached to a management plan and goals that the land stewards lay out. And then these happen in perpetuity, regardless of who owns the land. The Woodlands Trust will be there when land changes hands. So we ensure that future stewards will be supported in the management of their woodlands, the sustainable management of their woodlands. One thing that really stands out, or one of the things that makes us stand out, is that we actually allow sustainable forestry to happen on easement properties. And we'll get into that a little bit, but this is something that's highly unique to our organization. And I think a really great way to provide both economic sustainability and environmental sustainability for private woodland stewards. We're also offering the opportunity for woodland stewards to access the carbon market as a way to fund the easements. I'm going to get into the details a little bit more about that, but there is going to be a financial incentive component as well for woodland stewards. And then finally, we've integrated opportunities to for private woodland stewards and woodlot owners to contribute to our protected area targets. So this would be Canada's conservation goals or Nova Scotia's conservation goals. So that's a pretty exciting component too that hasn't been done before. So we're really trying to push the envelope in terms of supporting biodiversity while supporting like economic sustainability for private woodland owners. So how do we do this? And the core document, the core program material is this Working Forest Easement. So what is that? So Working Forest or community easements are a legally binding agreement between an eligible body, which is the land trust, and the landowner through the Community Easements Act. And that's a piece of legislation that was written in 2012. And what this document does is really outlines the restrictions and allowances, or what we call agreed practices, regarding land use on the property. So this has to do with development and building, natural resource extraction, including forest harvesting, as well as road building. And this is not an exhaustive list, but just some examples. And the real important part here is that the easements are tied to the deed of the property, no matter who owns it. So once the easement is on a piece of land, it doesn't really come off, and it is, defendable by law in perpetuity. So it's a really strong piece of protection for private woodlands. So one thing to note too is that the actual forest management services, or if you have if you are planning to do forest management on your property, the Working Woodlands Trust is not conducting that. We still would be working through our through existing regional service providers like the WWSC, oh my god, the Western Woodlot Services Co-op, as well as North Nova, for example, as well as other trusted partners. So these are really core partnerships that help us provide these services for woodland owners. So one thing to note that's really important too is that a working forest or a community easement is not the same thing as a conservation easement. So they operate using different legislation. Our working forest easements are using the Community Easements Act, and the conservation easements use the Conservation Easements Act. And this is by design, and our organization is designed to complement existing traditional conservation-focused land trusts, filling the gap for working forests and working forest conservation. So we want to protect and preserve the the working landscape. And this is done very clearly through the allowable practices that are written in our easements. And we'll get into that a little bit in a second. I guess the other piece here is that we really need to drive home that all forestry on easement properties must be guided by ecological forestry. And what do I mean by that? So this is our working definition of ecological forestry, which is any merchantable and non-merchantable forestry activities or silviculture that consider climate adaptivity and mimic natural disturbances while maintaining biodiversity features and ecological function. So prohibited practices, for example, would include unsustainable or ecologically inappropriate forestry practices, including clear cutting, overstory removal, salvage harvests, or the removal of permanent retention features. Yeah, and this is something too that's really going to be tied into a management plan, which is something that our service providers or the trust will be able to provide. So a little bit about our easement process. We want to recognize that many woodlands are multifunctional and might have areas, or woodland stewards might have areas that they don't wish to put under easement, and that's totally okay. We have a mechanism to capture this, and that is a zoning practice. So at the beginning, when folks are kind of being onboarded to the trust, we'll go through this practice kind of at a kitchen table with maps, and look at your property and determine which areas will kind of be under easement and which will not. So within the easement zone is what we're calling the working forest zone. And that's where ecological forestry is allowed. Excuse me, just one second. The easement zone, however, would exclude any agriculture or future agricultural use. So this is cropland or pasture field that isn't going to be reforested, that kind of thing. We're also going to exclude any current or future residential sites. So this is something to keep in mind, excuse me, while we're going through the process, is thinking about any future builds that you might want to do. And then thirdly, we have this concept of the conservation zone. And this is a forever wild zone, which is kind of no-go in terms of forestry altogether. You know, light recreational use is totally good, but any management activities would not be allowed. And these are the areas that we're hoping can contribute to the conservation targets set by the country, by Canada, as well as Nova Scotia. I'll just note too that every property is going to look a little bit different in terms of zoning. Most likely, all of them will have a working forest zone, but not all of them will have an agricultural zone. Maybe not all of them will even have a residential zone. People might be placing a strictly just a woodlot under easement, and that's totally fine. Similarly, the conservation zone isn't a mandatory thing. So you've heard me mention these agreed practices. And essentially this means like what is and is not allowed on the property. These are the key tenets to our easement agreement, and we've worked really hard to flush these out. These agreed practices apply to all easement properties and are not negotiable. So we have 3 categories of different kinds of activities. We have permitted, restricted, and prohibited. So permitted activities This would be hiking, trail clearing, non-commercial foraging, or motorized vehicle use on designated roads. Restricted activities, this is kind of where the forestry activities occur, or the ecological forestry activities occur. I will note here that they do require a 60-day notification period to commencing. And this is so that we understand what you're doing on your land and we know what to expect upon our next monitoring visit. There's a good chance that we will come and visit and say hi and kind of check in on what you're doing, but it might not happen every time. So these would be activities such as any kind of forest harvesting, new road construction, or maybe restoration projects such as planting. And then finally, we have the prohibited activities. And this is really why we have the easements in places. We want to restrict or not restrict, we want to prohibit any of these activities to ever happen on any easement property. And these are those large landscape changing practices such as clear cutting, or liquidation, harvesting, subdivision, or new residence construction. So I'll just tie this last point back into our previous slide on zoning. So if you do anticipate that your property will have a new construction or a new residence construction on it, it would be really important to highlight that in the zoning practice before your property is fully under easement. But it is doable. So I guess it's also important here to say that this process requires a lot of forethought and really thinking about what will happen to your land after you. If you have a family member that you're passing it on to, it's great to loop them into these kind of conversations and talk about how, the kind of map of your property might look into the future. Excuse me, I got a tickle. Okay, so this is our rough eligibility for an easement. So currently we're looking for people who have 200 forested acres or more to participate. We'd like those woodlots to have 50% or more mature forest, which is over 60 years. We're great with people who are conducting forest management in an ecological way on their property, or if it's in a natural state, we welcome that as well. Some of the nice to haves, but is not required, is an FSC certified forest management plan. If you do not have that, we can help you get one. We would love it if your property adds to contiguous forested landscapes for that landscape connectivity piece. Minimal human structures and buildings would be preferable, but it's not a no if you have them. And then also the presence of wildlife or special habitat features. So we're always looking for species at risk or special habitats, vernal pools, that kind of thing. So that's a little bit about the easements, what they look like, who we're looking for. But the other piece that's really important to note is the kind of price tag that comes along with this. So as easement holders, the trust is responsible for the long-term monitoring and stewardship of easement properties. And that's staff time over a long period of time. Remember that our easements are in perpetuity. So we need to put aside money for each property under easement to be able to pay for these long-term monitoring and stewardship costs. So the costs of the endowment is largely dependent on the area of the woodlot, as well as the risk of infractions. So as I said, we're doing this annual monitoring by staff. Shayla is our stewardship coordinator, so this is her job. As well as possible liability costs for negotiations and legal defense. So all of this kind of wraps up into a neat little number of $100 per acre for the endowment fund. So it's expensive, like a 200 acre woodlot would be $20,000. Excuse me. So traditional conservation-based land trusts will often either fundraise for the endowment cost or actually ask for a cash donation from landowners. And what we're doing is a little bit different. So we're looking to carbon to finance our endowments. And this is done by aggregating a pool of 10,000 acres. So the carbon market is completely inaccessible to small woodlot owners. You need to have that 10,000 acres to even get into the market. So it's very exclusive. And what the trust is suggesting, what we're doing is putting together those 10,000 acres across many different woodlot owners to access the carbon market as a group. So we are working with a third-party carbon developer who is responsible for the marketing and selling of the credits from this 10,000 acre pool. Oh my goodness, sorry. We're working with a carbon developer who's going to sell them and market them for us. And so the trust will have an agreement with the carbon developer, and then the trust will have a carbon agreement with every landowner as well. So this is kind of where that 200 acre minimum comes from, is that we're trying to reach that 10,000 acre pool with the smallest amount of landowners possible, for the administrative burden, and because this is just our first time around, and we would like to work with fewer to start. I guess another important point here is that the carbon agreement between the landowner and the trust is a 40-year term. And that's kind of like fairly standard for most carbon projects. And I guess too, it's important to say that this carbon agreement is independent from the easement agreement, and it actually needs to happen first, and then the easement agreement happens afterwards. But there is a time limit on the carbon agreement of 40 years, and then the easement is in perpetuity, so it is forever. So a little breakdown of how that might look. So this is just an example scenario of how we anticipate the carbon revenue to be split up. So the endowment is going to be approximately 40% of the total carbon value associated with your woodlot. And that's, we kind of got that number from abundance of research with similar organizations in the Northeast United States. So that's to cover the long-term stewardship and monitoring of easement properties is the endowment, 40%. The admin costs and insurance is 20%, and that is the developer's fee, essentially. We don't have any say in that. But we anticipate approximately 40% to be remaining for the landowner to be paid out over this 40-year term. So it's, it's not the total carbon value, but the total carbon value is paying for the long-term stewardship and monitoring of your property, ensuring that your property is preserved and your stewardship legacy is upheld in perpetuity. And then you'll also receive an annual check in the mail for that 40% over 40 years as a kind of cherry on top. So we are also looking, just a note at the bottom here, we are also looking to options for landowners to donate that 40% back to the land trust if that's what they wish, or provide an avenue for them to donate to other conservation organizations, like the Mi'kmaq Focus Land Trust. That's kind of coming. So these are the next steps for folks who are interested. The kind of basic bare bones to get started with us is that we need your contact information and to know that you're interested. The property information, such as the PID, would be very helpful for us to get a sense of what kind of land you're working on. And then as well, if you have a management plan, to provide a copy of that would be highly valuable, because that contains both forest inventory data and potential treatments that you might have done or planning to do. Things that you can do to prepare for us is an acquisition evaluation by NSWWT. But the kind of bottom four are a little bit more important. So we have the completing the boundary line maintenance. That's something that's highly important for us. Consider land use zoning. So that conversation about the residential, the easement zone, the conservation zone, thinking about that a little bit in advance would be very helpful. Putting a management plan in motion if you don't have one, or if it's out of date. So we do require that management plans be at least, or at most, 10 years old. So if it is a little bit older, it would be great to get that renewed. Excuse me. And then kind of a little bit further down the line, we could talk about reviewing the easement and carbon agreements with your own lawyer. So that's something that we advise all participants to do, is to check in with their lawyer about these things. We have our lawyer, and we recommend you having yours as well. Yeah, so these are kind of our next steps. We're spring and summer, it's a busy field season. We're onboarding landowners, so doing these initial kind of meet and greets and planning the next steps with folks who are wanting to put an easement on their property. We're going to be starting our baseline assessments and carbon inventories. We're investigating. Well, we will proceed with a charitable status application, and this will allow for land donations as well as eligibility for a tax incentive program called Eco Gift. And then in the fall, we're hoping to get some carbon agreements signed and continue active recruitment. And then all of this is kind of guided by our goal to reach that 10,000 acre pool for the carbon program, and we'll have that 10,000 acres under Working Forest Easement by the end of 2025. So that's the gist of the presentation here. If you have your phone on you, you can use our fancy dancy QR code to check out our frequently asked questions. But what would be more fun is that we can have a little bit of a discussion now, maybe. Oopsie, I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, Mari.
Yeah.
We haven't yet had any questions come in the chat, but I will be opening the camera and mics for participants. So I would ask folks, if you have a question, if you could please use the raise hand icon at the top of your screen. And then we can, we can do our best here to answer them. Mari, maybe do you want to, if we're
if we don't have the chattiest group, maybe, oh, we do have a question here. Peter. Peter, you're on mute. There you
Hear
go.
me now?
Yes.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. 200 acres is the minimum. If you had two adjacent 100-acre lots, could you do that as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I'm thinking a couple areas, there's like 200 acre or 100-acre lots, but there's two or three together.
Yeah,
And
that would be fabulous.
does this help qualify for the intergenerational tax deferral?
Yes.
Okay.
That's our understanding. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
'Cause usually if it's a managed woodlot, that works anyway.
Yeah, the one kind of I guess like workaround we're looking into in terms of tax, aside from the eager gift program and gaining charitable status and accessing that, which we're hoping to do soon as well, is we're looking at the kind of woodlot owner that doesn't necessarily do active management on their woodlot. So sometimes those individuals are taxed. You know, if you have a conservation easement on your woodlot, you wouldn't be taxed. So we've been chatting with folks at Property Valuation Services, specifically on the scenario where, you have a landowner with, say, a larger conservation zone, or a landowner that doesn't intend to do management, but they have a community easement. So hopefully alleviating a bit of the tax burden for that kind of unique situation.
Okay.
Anyone else with questions? We do have an FAQ kind of set up. I don't know, Mari, if you want to
Yeah, I'll just share my screen again.
pull
here.
up some of those. We can answer some hard questions for people. We recognize it's a large amount of information to digest. And we encourage landowners to reach out to us, and we can provide copies of our draft agreements. So particularly right now, we've been working on signing letters of intent with landowners. So just basically that we're happy working together, and that, participants have reviewed the easement agreement, and, that we intend on placing an easement before such and such date. And then with that, we do have our draft community easement agreement, which we've spent some time developing, and it never quite feels done, but I think we're nearly there. So that's a kind of key document to review as well, but that doesn't have to be done comprehensively until much later, as well as kind of before actually entering into the community easement, we'll have a carbon specific agreement to sign with landowners too. So this is why we do recommend involving your lawyer, as well as, we retain legal counsel to kind of help out with transactions, and, we can help answer questions as they come. Mari, do you think out of any of these you want to tackle?
Well, I mean, the first one, what happens to my woodlot if I choose to sell it, or once I pass away and my children inherit it? It's largely the same than what would happen without an easement. Kind of you retain full ownership of your land with an easement on it. And the easement kind of just follows follows the land to the next owner. So it does have the potential to affect resale values. But with hope, some of these other kind of workarounds that we're working on will help alleviate some of the tax burden that could come with that. How does the easement affect my property rights? What do you think about that one, MJ?
Yeah, that's a good question. The premise of the easement agreement is that you can continue. Most folks who are interested in obtaining an easement with us are generally see the easement document as being something positive for the long-term stewardship of their land. And of course, we field a lot of questions regarding, can I continue to get firewood? And of course, that's kind of the core tenet of our organization, is that it is that built into our purpose statement, that we allow forestry and ecological forestry within these working forest community easements. So you still retain the right to use your property as long as it falls under our agreed practices. And I'll note that those agreed practices are an appendix to the draft easement agreement. So if folks are interested in looking at the easement agreement, those agreed practices come along with it. And one kind of question that does come up is there's this idea of how much influence can you have as a landowner on future practices? And we do try and keep the agreed practices standard just to ease long-term monitoring and stewardship. So if you were to say not want hunting to occur on your property, that probably wouldn't be a realistic restriction for us to uphold as the easement holder. So we work with these agreed practices, that permitted, restricted, and prohibited uses, and those stay the same no matter who owns the property.
The next one we have here is
We have a
oh great, sorry, I can't see anything, so
oh David, you have a question?
Yeah, could you go back to the slide showing the 40%, 20%, 40%?
yeah, absolutely.
So I had a question on the
Oh God.
you mentioned that the 40% that would go to the landowner would be paid over the 40 years, so 1% a year.
Right.
Is that because the total carbon value, the 100%, when that agreement is signed with the organization that wants to buy carbon credits, are they paying out their money in a fraction of over 40 years, or is that the reasoning behind the 1% a year?
So there's a couple reasons. So it's not actually 1% a year. It's weighted. There's more money distributed at the beginning of the project because there's this idea of stored carbon and sequestered carbon. So sequestered carbon is the carbon that's growing on your woodlot over that 40-year period. But then there's also the carbon that's already stored on your woodlot. So that carbon that's already stored on your woodlot is worth more than those, like what we call like avoided emissions, or the carbon that's being stored over time. So there is a greater incentive or payout to the individual who is actually putting the easement on the property. And that's in that first 10 years. So the decision we've made is to continue to incentivize the practices that we're promoting in the easement agreement, that we would distribute the remainder of those funds over that remaining 30 years, just to kind of promote the easement agreement and to hopefully minimize any kind of future infractions that might occur or would violate the terms within the easement.
So just to follow up, the if the carbon value then is first defined by the carbon credit organization and your organization, is that the basis on which the payments are made? In other words, they will pay so much upfront, or so much in the first 10 years, and then a different amount over the next 30 years. Is that 40% going to the landowner portion? Is that sort of in light of how much is being estimated as the carbon value by the organizations? Is it still worked out in some kind of ratio that is based on how the carbon value is set?
Yeah, and that's the ratio that we have here is based on what we expect for current carbon prices, and they will change over time. So there is the likely chance that the landowner payment would end up being more. We can't say exactly, but the credits themselves are actually issued on an annual basis. So it's not like you're not being paid exclusively for net present value of carbon today. There will be some fluctuation in that price over the term. So I think generally that's probably a good thing, right? Because likely value will increase over time. Yeah.
So could you give me a rough idea of a piece of land on the South Mountain that is has mature forest that's only been sustainably forested, and even if it's numbers you're getting from your counterparts in New England or wherever you were getting data from, how much is a 200 acre acre is a carbon credit compared to, well, I know what land values are. So how much, what's the range of carbon credit values per acre?
It's a great question. And it's not an easy one for me to spout off. I think like based on our assessment is we probably foresee the value for carbon being a little bit higher than the value for the endowment. So it's not a huge amount on an annual basis. So it could be as low as $500, but it could be as high as $2,000. We just don't, and I also don't know, that would be kind of on an even keel basis. So again, there would be more value at the beginning of the project. So something along those lines. So it's really, that's kind of why we say this whole arrangement is really for folks who are very invested in this idea of the easement and not necessarily just looking for, a possible financial gain from the carbon agreement. It's kind of just like a cherry on top, as like a gesture of, thanks for doing this, and here's a small amount of cash to kind of to go on top. Yeah.
So you said something about it'd be something like a few $100 per year, and that would be for a 200 acre portion. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. So
okay,
I would say anywhere from 500 would probably be the low end per year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my actual question was, and it's a different question in a way, the 100% number, the total carbon value, what sort of numbers are you seeing for total carbon value per acre for our South Mountain type forests?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
Like the last kind of pricing we got from developers were like in the high teens per ton of carbon. And then the way that the project sold, it's sold in that, big 10,000 acre pool. So it's actually not something that we're stratifying on a woodlot to woodlot basis. It would be very challenging for us to do that. So that's the idea of a pool. So there might be some woodlots that have lower carbon values, some with higher, but there'll be more equal distribution between the woodlots. So that's why we do have the requirement of greater than 50% mature forest, because we don't want the entire value of the pool to be lowered with, you know, a bunch of properties that have been recently clear cut.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Did that generate anyone else? It's a challenging topic, and we are figuring out as we go too, but we're working with a carbon developer that's very knowledgeable and has a North American scope. So they're actually one of the larger carbon developers out there, but all of the carbon credits would be sold to within the voluntary carbon market. So that would be kind of open to purchase for, you know, anyone from tech companies to oil and gas. So there's always a bit of a ethical challenge sometimes on where the carbon offsets go as well. But we feel quite confident with the developer that we're working with that they'll market our project accordingly. So I think, Mari, like if folks don't have any more questions, like we don't have to keep people here.
Okay.
But we do really appreciate everyone who came and participated today. And please reach out to us if you do have any questions. That we understand that these matters are a little bit sensitive, and that we're happy to have one-on-one conversations with folks whenever it's convenient for you. Or even we'll come and visit you on your property if that's of interest as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I think, yeah, you should have our email, but info@nsworkingwoodlandstrust.org is the best place to find us, or our website, nsworkingwoodlandstrust.org. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday evening. I know it's sunny outside, so thanks for coming.
All right, thanks everyone, and we'll also have a recording of this available too, and we'll circulate it afterwards if you want to go back and reference any of our questions or points that were made. Great. Well, we'll let everyone go then.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. We may need to end the meeting.
Yeah, I could just, okay.
Yeah.
I'll leave it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.